통원대 성을 테스트에 쉬어이 테스트에 영화를 성을 테스트에 깔래 가고 싶은다. 아니 정말 벽에 고추를 봐. 정말 개만 정말 고추를 봐. 이게 빠라빠라도 인지치 가시가시 되게 셔셔는 기봐요 말와. 아니 남주 땅 아주 파수 표가 요사, 표가 망부 요사, 표가 용용 요사, 이제 아주 투두징 아주 아니 상마가 누구여래, 아주 고층에 몇 개절이 아니 미만한 점도 이제 와서에 계신 걸 봐. It's very important to build relation between us who are supposed to be the leaders now and the general public population and particularly youth, because the generation that came from Tibet. 변에 녀만 수 용하시게 되게 딱 무슨 gemba 되게 가시에 스테이트와 이게 나눠내 딱 군주기 깔래 겹겹겹 우리 겨울음식 두지거리는 때니 군주 깔래 겹니 딱 아주 미럽도 수 우리 트란스 미럽도 수시 두신이 딱 랩데요래 아주 지소 사다다로 차야지 두신 랩데요래 now that 변에 수 용의 generation, those who came from Tibet, they are mostly retired now. They are beyond 60. Since those people who came in 1959, they are already 63, 64 years old. Even those who were born when we just came into exile, they are already that old. So I think that they go pasulage doa, music on the 집에 샵지슈 어두 세제 아니 retired share left side. Now it is the generation like us who were born in exile, and who is taking over the leadership role within the Tibetan community. Now in future, it's you, your generation, who has to take the responsibility. I can't do a game, Makina. I do a game, make of said the king marwa. Easy to do a game, king marwa. So future, the Maomba, Tandu, Madu Pearl Park, Kapuchi lawyer, Maravina, and we have to keep continuing to struggle for the freedom of our people inside Tibet. So for that, it is your responsibility to take up the leadership role. That is why I try to make it a point to meet as many younger generation as possible. I would have loved to spend more time with the youth than the elders. But the schedule is such that it takes too time to control the suicide. It is too time to one which do basic information when you go to school and if people ask you about Tibet, you should be in a position to talk about it. But remember, 아니 별 가와요 레스라네 I don't know love 좋아 아니 이래 러브는 되게 배배기 꾸적 제토의 영화를 봐 then you will not be able to represent the Tibetans inside Tibet. So it's very important that you know about Tibet. So today I will just brief you a little bit about how we need to explain ourselves. 총을 던지 몇 총을 타면서 그러시더라고요. 이 도와지 우면 남지 채나 두시네. 안아주 벽이 꼴을 제시게베 갑대. 안아주 두스토를 빼는 안아주 현존 나로리아. 거리라베 고외 신감 정수는 아주 결국이 봐. 결국 열배 나라도 두서 봐. 거리라베 고외 신감 정 결국 열 봐. 두시 서버터 강리시디 스노우 마운틴을 봐. 라와시디 is like a fence. That the ranges that's in degree. 아니 Shinkham Jones the heavenly abode singers. So we define our own land as land surround the heavenly abode, the land surrounded by snow mountain ranges. The Kashin is na any yogi south side la Homola, any Himalayan ranges. Himalayan ranges are the highest mountain ranges in the world. Last time I was in Japan and I was speaking to the students there and I asked them, which is your highest mountain in Japan? 그래서 하고 Japan 나 리토슈 그래. 아무래도 높정 셴바까지 되게 많지. 아무래도 지금 마도식. Japan retouched the Mount Fuji level, and that's about 3,700, 3,800 meters high, which is equal to about 12,000 feet above sea level. Sea level ne, kada kyan to sea level ne pe maguru ba sea level ne kalsuri ta dai 가지고 있는 altitude. 시야도 하고 이외 이제 땅에 영화 먼저 개발소에 동발 때도 내장에 영화를 this is the Japanese concept. Like your highest mountain, 3,700 meters high, is like base camp in Tibet, because Tibet is very high. Right? Westerners, people who came from the West, from Europe, from North America, when they came to Tibet, I read one book called Tibet Outpost in 1906, written in 1906. And one of the chapter was titled as Roof of the World. So Westerners started calling Tibet as the roof of the world. Because Tibet has, the Tibetan plateau is highest in the world. And today Asians call it the Water Tower of Asia. Water Tower of Asia. The rivers that originate from Tibet flows into Pakistan and flows into India and into Pakistan. The Indus River today. Indus is the cradle of Indus Valley civilization. The Mesopotamian civilization, the Egyptian, and the Chinese civilization, the Manguyo, all the zoo, any Jagal, Payuna, and a river like Brahmaputra, Sangbola, that originates from Tibet, Western Tibet, comes all the way to Eastern Tibet, takes a U-turn and goes into India and Bangladesh. So we already counted how many countries? Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Nepal, 4 countries in South Asia. Right? That's Southeast Asia and Anola, rivers that originate from Tibet goes into Burma, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam. Burma Irrawaddy river Lagandre, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, Mekong River. Right? 4 plus how many more? Burma, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam. 4 plus 5, 9 countries. And 2 major rivers that goes into China also originate from Tibet, from the Tibetan plateau. The Yellow River and the Yangtze River. And Yellow is the cradle of Chinese civilization. Right? And that river feeds most of the northern part of China. And Yangtze River that flows south feeds much of the southern part of China. So these are 2 lifelines of China. If China does not care about Tibet's environment, then it's going to affect them more than anybody else. Right? Last year, about 5-6 months ago, the Yangtze River, the volume of Yangtze River went down by about 50%. So hydroelectricity generation stopped. Right? Navigation on that river also stopped. So these are consequences if you don't take care about Tibet's environment and ecological situation. And because of its altitude, Tibet is also home to some of the very unique flora and fauna. Flora and fauna sina Simjian Dang, any Jishinglo, right? So plants and animals. All those Shinida. Now, today, environmental scientists call the Tibetan plateau as the 3rd pole. 3rd pole. Which are the 2 other poles? How do you are? South and North Pole, South Pole. Right, South Pole, North Pole, and Tibet Pole. Why? Because Tibet has the largest amount of glaciers and permafrost that feeds all these rivers that flows into 10 different countries. And these are some of the most densely populated areas in the world. Somebody now, Mimbo Mangshuchin, you are talking about 1.4 billion people out of 8 billion people in this world. And India is also close to 1.4 billion people. Pakistan is also one of those densely populated areas. Burma, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, these are also very densely populated areas in the world. So some people say that, some analysts estimate that 1.8 billion to 2 billion people, either directly or indirectly, are dependent on rivers that originate from Tibet. That's how important Tibet's plateau is. So in future, people say that the Third World War could happen because of water. Today, we are political refugees. But I tell them, another few decades down the line, there might be more environmental refugees. Because China does not share hydrological data with any of these downstream riparian countries. And China is building so many dams on Tibetan rivers. And one of the dams that is being built now, just recently I was in the northeast of India, Arunachal Pradesh, because a river that comes from inside Tibet flows through Arunachal Pradesh to Assam, Bangladesh. So there is a lot of work going on there. They are building a dam twice the size of the biggest dam in the world, the Three Gorges Dam in China. They are building twice the size of that kind of a dam, which will produce 3 times the hydroelectricity that is being produced by Three Gorges Dam. And the whole Himalayan belt is a seismic zone. Because you know, the Asian plate and the Gondwana plate came together, and the friction of these plates underneath gave birth to these Himalayan mountains. Even now, scientists say that Himalaya is growing. In future, we are talking about the dam. If an earthquake happens in that region, and if that dam breaks, then what will happen to all these people in the downstream countries? They will all be washed away. It will be a serious catastrophe. So in future, we are talking about water security, we are talking about food security. What's food way? Or is it total way? What's food way? On the day of stand up, Lana Candidates, Lana Suggestion, Candidates, the Antidiciores. That Purgi, Saji Yachijun Geshavina, the size of Tibet. Any guesses? In million square kilometers. Using on Japan, Shindusumagi, Japan, Lavi, transfer Lumbegi, it's about 16 or 18 times the size of Japan. Tibet is very, very big. It's 10 times the size of UK. Because UK is only about 240,000 square kilometers, and Tibet is 2.5 million square kilometers, which is almost 1/4 of the total landmass of China. Some people think that Tibet is small like Bhutan or Nepal. It's not so. In a population, because it's all hills and mountains, because there are mountains and valleys. So far, we have been saying the Tibetan population is 6 million. Now, according to the latest survey, demographic survey of the Chinese government, it looks more likely that the Tibetan population over the last 2-3 decades has increased up to 7 million. So Tibetan population right now inside Tibet is close to 7 million Tibetans. And in exile, including all of us here, we are only about 130,000 Tibetans. In India, Nepal and Bhutan, about 80,000 Tibetans. And then in North America, Europe, Australia, and elsewhere around the world, it's about 50,000 Tibetans. So we are altogether only about 130,000 Tibetans in exile. This is just to give you a brief overview of how do you define Tibet. Shumamiji Geshtivina, Persona Kadeyore, other big altitude, Perin Shudri, Perin Dagioresra, land surrounded by snow mountain ranges, roof of the world, water tower of Asia, third pole. These are different names for Tibet. And by that name itself, you will understand the significance of the land of Tibet. And the Tibetan language, many people think that since we are occupied by the Chinese, they think that Tibetan language might have something to do with the Chinese language, which is not so. Because Chinese is pictographic, right? Our language came from India. So even now, the alphabets, Kaka, Kana, Jaja, Chanya, Tata, Tana, Baba, Pama, Tata, Tanya, because someone Gagaji de Chipayuri, Gagagi, Tana Hindi alphabet, Ka, 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 Ga, Nga, Cha, 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 Nya, Dusini, Cha, 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 Ja, Nya, Dusini, Hindi, so 7th century, King Sonze Gambo sent his minister, Tim Samboda, most probably to Kashmir those days, because Kashmir was a hub of learning in those periods, from 2nd century onwards. And then in 8th century, Buddhism came to Tibet. 7th century, of course, statues came from both China and from Nepal, because the king, Tibetan emperor, married a Chinese princess and a Nepalese princess. And they brought one statue of Buddha. But the real teaching of Buddha, or the institutionalization of Buddhism, started only in 8th century. 8th century, I want to number should lip and to do some of the Indian master Shandarakshita advised that instead of him teaching Sanskrit to the Tibetans, since Tibetans already have a language, he advised that why don't you translate all the Sanskrit texts into Tibetan. So that at that time we must have had the biggest transliteration house in the world, because we translated every available Sanskrit Buddhist text into Tibetan language. So that is why today we are a repository of one part of ancient Indian wisdom. Maybe I'll go over a little bit about Tibetan history, right? To give you, to let someone that Samolo can show chick seminar on a couple of days, seminar on Pagashani. Right, Yaman Sikyong Penpa Tsering like steps on, quite the legit shares on and seminar, there's shit, and a Shuman can do those loyal and take months low in it, and then Pantogre. Right, because Nanzo Puggy Luguti, Nanzuki Malovina, Mission Basuji Lomata. No one else will study Tibetan history unless they are researchers on Tibet. Today, Chinam on the Chigi, and Pivot Yoshing and over the day in the Mother Pivot Yutagmarwa. In the summertime, Chansudan, Nanzuki Pivot, Mother Dochina, and Mother Pivot, you laugh. We have Yongdagi Ken and Tuadi, when you don't guess Chigi, your Asian Shiggy, that is a Asian Shiggy. And yet it's a ancient Sonzengambo Paro to Tsiwina, Yalung Sambo dynasty to Chimachi. And in the 7th to 9th century, Tibet was a huge empire. We even invaded the capital of China called Xi'an those days, which later became Nanjing and now it's Beijing. Right? We invaded China's capital, dethroned the emperor, put a puppet in his place, and we even went west up to the present-day Samarkand in Uzbekistan. That was how large Tibet's empire was at one time between 7th to 9th century, from King Sonzengambo to Chisung Deodzien to Chirvachen. So these are the three most well-known religious kings of Tibet. Then Tibet disintegrated for about 400 years, from 9th century to 13th century. So from 13th century, we developed a priest-patron relationship with the Mongols, led by Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan is the 5th Khan after Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan konungwe. Genghis Khan pe merciless reda. If he wanted to invade Utah, he will kill everybody in Seattle. Then before you reach Utah, everybody surrenders, naturally, for fear of death. So they were merciless, they didn't believe in any religion, whatever. When Kublai became the Khan, after Mongol Khan, because his father is Altan Khan, but there are so many tribes in Mongolia. His father was Altan Khan. Altan Khan invited Sikyong Penpa Tsering to preach Buddhism to them. And when after Altan Khan died, then Kublai Khan took over, and Sikyong Penpa Tsering's nephew, Zhongui Chugi Papa, became the imperial preceptor of the Mongol Khan. So we developed this priest-patron relation. We teach them religion, and then they give us protection in return. And then that went on for about 100 years. So Sakyabas ruled Tibet for about 100 years when the Mongols invaded China. So we had relation with the Mongols even before Kublai Khan invaded China. When Kublai Khan invaded China, then it was termed as the Yuan dynasty, Y-U-A-N. So for Chinese historians, Yuan is only that period when the Mongols ruled China. But the Mongols were there even before the Yuan and even after the Yuan. That went up to 1368. So from 1368 to 1644, then China was ruled by the Ming dynasty. Mings are the real Chinese, Han Chinese. Within those 300 years, from 1368 to 1644, Tibet was ruled by 3 hegemonies, succeeding Sakyabas. Okay, so you have the Pamadruba hegemony for 100 years, Rinpoche hegemony for about 100 years, Devatsangpa for about 100 years, till 1642. In China, the Mings were dethroned by the Qings in 1644. But in Tibet, the fifth Dalai Lama took over the reign of Tibetan leadership in 1642. That's 2 years before the Mings took over. The Qings took over the Mings. And the Qings are Manchus. So Chinese, the general perception, the societal perspective of a Chinese, a Han Chinese, is that Manchus are not Chinese because Manchus are invaders from their perspective. If you watch Kung Fu movies, you will find that Chinese are always the protagonists and the Manchus are always the antagonists. So even now there are a lot of academic discourses into China as to who is the real Chinese. Han Chinese? Are the Han Chinese the only Chinese? Or the Mongols also Chinese? Or the Tibetans also Chinese? Or the East Turkestanis also Chinese? Or the Manchus also Chinese or not? So if Mongols are also Chinese, then China can claim half of the world because Genghis Khan invaded half of the world. Right. On the nature of that is look at the Mongolia, the and Qings ruled from 1644 to 1911 in China. And the Dalai Lamas ruled Tibet from 1642 till we lost our country to communist China in, let us say, 1951, because that was the period, that was the time when when the 17-point agreement was signed in May 1951. Before that, Chinese government invaded Chengdu in October 1950. A brief overview, Doge. The Yalong Tsangpo dynasty, we have a recorded history of 2,200 years. And Yalong Tsangpo dynasty goes back 900 years before Tibet became an imperial country, where Tibet's territory extended over large swaths of Central Asia And then Tibet disintegrated for about 400 years, but that was also the time for Buddhist revival. So you have Kagyupa tradition, you have Sakyapa tradition during those periods. Tidu Pyogi and Jemaba Chidapet Dagal Tama Shistile, Sum Shistile, Chuna Megawa. And you have to walk all the way from Tibet into India to learn Buddhism. Yama Pyogi. Naman Lokalish Vishkavirwa. All the Rishia those in a brief history to Sheva. So, till Communist China invaded Tibet, Tibet was an independent country. And that is what I go and speak to governments. To politicians. We tell them that if you keep repeating this statement that Tibet is part of People's Republic of China, you are going against international law. Because in international law, any agreement signed post-aggression is null and void. It's not considered legal. So if international law has to be applied, it has to be applied to Tibet as well. Then we also tell them that on the one hand, you keep saying Tibet is part of PRC, People's Republic of China, at the behest of the Chinese government. And on the other hand, governments keep saying that they support negotiation between His Holiness Dalai Lama or representatives of His Holiness Dalai Lama and the Chinese government. We tell them these two don't go together, these two contradict each other because China rules Tibet with an iron hand. And the whole international community keeps repeating this statement that Tibet is part of People's Republic of China. Then where is the reason for China to come and talk to us? That's the only leverage we have. Then we ask them the question, do you have any instances around this world where one country invades another country and then tells the whole international community to say that this is part of us? Even within China, is China asking international community to say that Manchuria is part of China or Mongolia is part of China or East Turkestan is part of China? No. Why only Tibet? Because the Chinese government knows that they have no legitimacy to rule over Tibet. All those things that are not the US-Tibet relations. I have a lot of stories to tell you, which might help you in future, but I think we don't have much time today. So I'll stop here. And if you have any questions, if you want to know anything aside from what I've said just now, on any topic that you want to know, please feel free.
Someone.
Maybe I'll talk a little bit about US-Tibet relations. Okay? I think the first person who came to Tibet from United States, his name was William Woodville Rockhill. Wood, Hill, Rock, so he's an adventurist by himself. So he was born in 1854 in Pennsylvania, and there was civil war going on in the United States. So his mother, to avoid civil war, took him to Europe, and he went to France, and he studied in an academy called the St. Clair's Military Academy. And during his teenage years, he studied Tibet, American Rida, in mid-19th century. And 당 아주 표가 되게 표가 장으로 장고 말이. 미셔봐 아주 표가 장고 봐. 어두시제 그런 표가 장 안티네 표기 дөmbegi 제바 the life of Buddha. He translated it into French, and then he translated also 아주 표기 수수탑에 도시아주 부다나 wargasi die 그 French engineer 그 위장. At that time in Europe, in France, and he was very influenced by two French, there were several visitors from Italy. From 16th century onwards, there were visitors from Europe to Tibet, but you can count them on your fingers. There are not too many. Any Italians live your French live your or those Italian in the 19th century, William Woodville Rockhill, there were two French people who came to Tibet in the mid-19th century, about 1854, 55, 1845, 46, and a difference of 10 years. But these two guys are named M. Gebet and Abbe Hugues, French Minich. They managed to come to Lhasa. Not many people could come to Lhasa at all. Right? And they have written a memoir of their travel from Europe to Mongolia to Tibet. And this really sparked interest in this young boy called William Woodville Rockhill. Right? And after he finished his studies in France, then he moved to the United States and he started a ranch and he got married. When he was in the United States, he again studied Sanskrit and Chinese. Why? Because he wanted to know more about Tibet. Sanskrit and in 1884, then he took off to Beijing in China. Right. At that time, it was not known as the U.S. Embassy, it was known as U.S. Legation. So he worked there for 5 years. From his earnings, then he left towards Tibet, because those days, not many people who could go into Tibet. Most of the people who came to Tibet were Christian missionaries. Because they considered Tibet as the last frontier where Christianity could not penetrate. Right. So, but he was not a Christian missionary. He was just interested in Tibet. And then he, in the winter of 1889, he reached Kumbu in Amdo region. And he stayed there for some time. And then he moved from south of Qinghai, that Songbogi, and then he passed the Dangla. He was not allowed to go into Lhasa, so he had to leave through Nanshan to Derge up to Tazedo on the Tibet-China border. He reached Tibet in 1889. And then when he came out, he wrote a book called The Lamas of Tibet. A lawyer, you can read those books. And then again he went back to Tibet in 1891. That time he was sponsored by the Smithsonian Institution and the National Museum, now in Washington, D.C. Again, he took the same route, but again, he was not allowed to go into Lhasa. And late 1990s, then he worked in the State Department for some time in Foggy Bottom in Washington, D.C. And he had brought out the teachings of the Buddha and the commentaries. It's about 110 volumes of Buddha's teachings. And Dege Kanyun, Dege is one of the printing press in Kham region. And then you have Natapara. Those are very few printing presses that, because you have to print, engrave every single word on wooden blocks in mirror format so that you can print it. So every single page you have wooden blocks. And 110 volumes, how many wooden blocks would you need? That's a lot of work. More than 110 volumes he brought from Tibet and he presented to the Library of Congress in the United States here. Library of Congress, Washington, D.C. It's a huge library just behind the Capitol building. Then now, Library of Congress has more than 16,000 volumes of books on Tibet and in Tibetan language. He was the first person to donate, contribute Dege Kanjur, to the Library of Congress in 1899. Then, the 13th Dalai Lama took over the temporal leadership, religious and temporal leadership of Tibet in 1895. 8 years after that, or 9 years after that, we were invaded by British India. Because why we call British India is because Britishers have already, they were already ruling India. So they sent their army into Tibet, called the Young Husband Expedition in 1904. There was a Canadian lady called Susan Reinhardt who came to Tibet in 1895. And her husband was a Dutchman from Europe, a long story but I'll cut short. And they gave birth to a baby in Tibet in 1896, 1895, 96. And the baby was just 2 years old and their ambition was to go to Lhasa. So they tried again the same route that William Woodville Rockwell had taken, but the baby died when they were crossing the Dangla Pass, which is a very high pass. Baby just died on the way. And her husband was killed by Tibetans. And this lady had to go by herself through Nangshan, Derge, and all these places, all the way to Kanting in Tarsito, bordering China and Tibet. And she wrote a book, now I don't remember the name, Tents and Temples of Tibet. This became very famous. And most of the missionaries who came to Tibet were from the Midwest of the United States, from Ohio to Indiana to Nebraska and all those places. And this lady suffered a lot. She went back to Canada in Toronto, and then she came again to Tibet in 1902 in Tarsito. And she's worked there, but along with her there were several other people. They were missionaries. For Dr. Sidney Sheldon, coming from Indiana. They started from 1908 to 1932. They stayed there. And from the generation American but William Woodville Rockwell is so fascinating. You count the hub and historically it's important for us because when Britishers invaded Tibet in 1904, then the 13th Dalai Lama had to leave to Mongolia. And in Mongolia, Russian scientists informed the 13th Dalai Lama that there is an ambassador of the US government in Beijing who would speak Tibetan. And that was the beginning of relationship between the 13th Dalai Lama and William Woodville Rockwell. So 13th Dalai Lama sent letters through his agents in Beijing to William Woodville Rockwell. And your president of that time was Theodore Roosevelt. Wow. And William had written to Theodore Roosevelt about meeting with the Dalai Lama, and then Roosevelt's returned letter to. So all these are very much there in the archives of U.S. presidential libraries. This is how many are there. Right. So those were the first instances of relations with the United States, and William Woodville Rockwell was transferred to Russia, and he didn't want to go, so but he must have been the first person to write a historical on Tibet in 1909. Because he himself was witness to the 13th Dalai Lama's meeting with the Chinese emperor at that time, the 13-year-old boy, the Empress Dowager. He wrote a book, he wrote a historical called The Relations Between the Manchus and the Dalai Lamas. It's just a 94-page document. And then you can go through those books. And then when you look for someone like no change your mind, that telling you that you can't take video not teach Shuma, having the Ming Chi, any to say it, and no way that it will help you a lot. Right? On the day, did you do? And this guy died in 1912. On the day, can't you name? Any US relationship, you know,
Rockhill kind of friends of the pre-condition.
So,
Rockhill, William Rockhill.
Puis, France n'est jamais. St. Clair's Military Academy had a Tibetan course. And then also he took extra classes in the National Museum of France at that time. He did some work on this channel. And then man, which is 1920s development, National Geographic Society had come into Tibet. Today, report today, and then in 1926 there was a guy called Sikyong Penpa Tsering who came to Tibet through Burma into Yunnan, and that time it was the other Roosevelt president. Kundu Panda Sikyong Penpa Panda. Panda is an animal not seen in the West. It was a myth kind of thing. Then he wanted to go to Lhasa, but to appease the 13th Dalai Lama, he kept sending Darshians and big dogs to Lhasa to appease His Holiness, and also send heating materials to Changmurwa and because foreigners could not go beyond Yangtze at that time, because that was the agreement we had with the British India. So if you have to go beyond Yangtze to Lhasa, then you have to have permit from the Lhasa government. But he could not go during the lifetime of the 13th Dalai Lama, because the 13th Dalai Lama died in 1932, but he visited Tibet from another side in 1933, and then he went back again in 1935. But before that, when he sent dogs to His Holiness to appease His Holiness, the 13th Dalai Lama also gave him 2 Lhasa apsos, the small doggies, from Tibet. The America Lhasa apso you someone soil cutting became he's known for that. In his obituary also, after he died, actually he's more known for saving the giant tortoise of the Galapagos. But in his obituary, it was more about him having brought the Lhasa apsos to Tibet, from Tibet to United States on the Lake Ejayare. And he wrote a book called The Fire Ox Here, because 1935 was Melang Law. The Fire Ox Here, that has to Grand Pearl to Yotan, the local you can read that also. Then in 1942, during the Second World War, Tibet remained neutral during the Second World War with the Allies and the other forces of the Japanese. To fight the Japanese, British India had to send their supplies through Tibet. So they wanted to seek permission from the Tibetan government to allow passage of supplies through Tibet, and they sent 2 people to Tibet. One was Ilya Tolstoy. Have any of you heard about Tolstoy before? When you met? Tolstoy was a literary giant in Russia. He was very well known for his literary work. And Ilya Tolstoy was his grandson, working in the State Department at that time. And he was accompanied by a mountaineer, because Tibet is very high, as I mentioned before, so you need people who understands climbing and all that. So they were Brooke Dillon. So Brooke Dillon and Ilya Tolstoy went to Tibet and talked with the Tibetan government. Of course, the Tibetan government didn't agree to send supplies through Tibet, but they had filmed Tibet's New Year of 1942. For the first time, Tibet was so those videos are still available on YouTube. Until in 1949-50, then the first television crew of United States, American Broadcasting Corporation, our father and son duo went to Tibet. 아니 대제 군인 술대 다 아메리카 나로 그 꼴 테마 당국 American Broadcasting Corporation 나로 땡. Those videos are also available on YouTube. If you know what to look for. And then around the same time, the United States already had some kind of the atomic bomb, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, so United States already was advanced in those kind of weapons. And East Turkestan, Uyghur, Xinjiang, I don't like to call them Xinjiang because that's the name given by Chinese government to these people. They are Uyghur people. They are East Turkestanis. So East Turkestan is supposed to have large reserves of uranium to produce nuclear energy. And the United States government did not want those uranium to fall in the hands of the Russians. So they sent two people from Beijing, from the embassy, to Urumqi area. Somehow they had to, because of certain circumstances, you can read those books called Into Tibet in 1949, written by Thomas Lai. Even today, when we go to the State Department, and if you get to go to the State Department in Foggy Bottom in Washington, D.C., I always make it a point to show it to the State Department people on the honors board. When you enter the State Department from C Street, you will see all these flags, and then on the side you have an honors list of people, of diplomats who died on duty. And there you will see this name, Colonel McKinnon Douglas. We will say it, the US government sent a message to Lhasa. The message reached very late to receive him well on the Tibetan border in the northern area. But since the message didn't come through, Tibetans killed the colonel. And his name is still there, Douglas McKinnon, 1949, Tibet. This is your own document. This is your own honors board. So that time it's not China. They wrote Tibet. 51,000 came here, 55 Sobogishi Wangye came here. Sobogishi Wangye is not a Tibetan, but he studied Buddhism in Tibet. But he had played a very important role in translating for our guerrilla trainees. He was also responsible for developing the Morse code to CIA to be training Tibet. Which in 56 Tango, those days they were not on the US soil here. They were sent to a place called Saipan. Saipan. Okay, Shima Konyua, Mariana Archipelago, Komanyua. Then Guam Konyua, Guam Konyua. So this place is north of Guam in the Mariana Archipelagos. Saipan, a place called Saipan, which used to be earlier in the hands of Germans and the Japanese. Then during the Second World War, the US invaded them, and then our people were sent there to train in guerrilla warfare, in signals, using arms, those kind of things. And these people were dropped back. That is another story. You can read this book called CIA in Tibet by James Morrison and something Convoy, I forgot his name. So there are two authors. These are very reliable books because these came out in 1996, 1996 or 2006 in G20, because these are based on many of the declassified documents to the State Department. In 1950, the government the US ambassador in India, Lloyd Henderson, is supposed to have written letters to the 14th Dalai Lama when His Holiness was on the border. So these are just names I'm giving you so that you have the imprint of these names on your brain when you grow up and if you read more books. And then 1959, we lost our country. 1960, we lost our country in the sense we had to come into exile in 1959. 1960, the country Seattle. Seattle, Seattle and the Washington University, they sent Willie Wiley Tyrrell to look for a Tibetan scholar, and they found this Deshung Rinpoche, a Sakya scholar. And Rinpoche, then they shoot, and they and the people of Dari Rinpoche, and Dari Rinpoche's any Tamogusho happens to be Deshung Rinpoche's niece, and they came here in the United States in 1960. And 1962, then this Kalmukwang, so asked His Holiness how he can help, and then His Holiness decided to send 4 monks to study English. So out of these 4 monks, one is no more. The one who is no more started this Deer Park in Madison. Even now that monastery is there. When His Holiness started coming to the United States in 1971, in 1981, that was the first time His Holiness gave Kalachakra teaching in Madison. Gishi Sohala was one among the 4, and the other 3 are still living here in the United States. One is in San Francisco. Whenever I go there, I meet him. He's very old now. He's a Sayapa. Again, and the other 2 were boys at that time. They were sent back to India, but they came back to the United States. They both are in medicine right now, for Shaw Rinpoche and Kamlu Rinpoche. So those are there. And then in 1963, under Pyushung Puja Tamare, on Liu Sha, Tibetan government representative was sent to New York. And then in 1964, we registered the Office of Tibet under the Foreigners Agents Regulation Act, FARA Act. It still exists, and you have Dr. Namgyela as the President's representative in the Office of Tibet. Okay, 1965-66, we had some relations with the Cornell University. We sent people to study management, accounts, and those kind of things in Cornell University, and some of them are here. Today, one is in Madison. Was one of them. And Daniela, Canada, Toronto, Prime Minister Johnson, Payut, and New York, Undu Shawaiva, Undu Shawaiva, the district training logistics training that went on for only 2 years. This year, and then 1965, Boston, he was there for only, he was invited by teachers for whom he worked in India, and he was there for 1 year, and he was to go back after his visa was expiring, but he was with his fruit juice and he wrote to President Johnson at that time. And Johnson wrote back, and he sought asylum, and now his family is very much there in Boston. But the family, Pala, Portland, there's someone here, review here. And Shagapa's sons were also here in the early 60s. Right? They were working for Pan Am. And 67, they have 69. He 69. Really? That you do 69. So 67, we sent 6 people, 6 Tibetans as lumberjacks. So Chinju Mediomata in a Shingtung door, Kozo Gege, Rangi Sambalo, Kozo Gamba Martin, do some Pimudas Bagama Timdu, Kozo Tungu didn't share your. So they came at 69 because the first batch was successful. They worked for a company called the Great Northern Paper Company. Right. This was successful, the 6 people. Then 21 people were sent, and he was one among them. 2 of them. Right. We worked together for 5 years in the parliament. So they are still here, the Tibetan lumberjacks. And then this got, the company, something went wrong with the company, and there was no GPS those days. You can ask them their stories. And New Jersey, and some of them drove all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast. They have the anthropology student, anthropology anthropology test. Two of them were from this region. So lumberjack people, how they came from East Coast to West Coast and got settled here is another story by itself. All those three. And 72, that 71, and 80s now, and Michix, Nisum, Shist, and Lobjon Chilayong, Reading University, Reading, Puchu, the Christian missionaries, and Puchu, the Chion, and meeting the new trans. Those churches, there was another group in San Francisco area. And in 1972, I went to Canada, 228 people we sent as part of the immigration program to Canada. They just outside Ontario, the Toronto, Lindsay, Belleville, Saskatchewan, Calgary area, Vancouver, BC, Vancouver, BC, most of those elders were those who came in and around 1972-73. That was Jimmy Carter's time. Okay? And then from 1979 onwards, His Holiness kept coming back to the United States. People also flocked to him. Many people loved his message of peace and compassion, and there were so many followers of His Holiness. In 1987, for the first time, His Holiness spoke at the U.S. Human Rights Caucus about the 5-point peace proposal. At that time, we had very few friends in the Congress because we didn't know the significance of the U.S. Congress. So there were people like Claire Bon Pell, Tom Lantos, even now Speaker Pelosi, she was a young girl at that time. And some of our old friends were like Senator Dianne Feinstein from California. She's still there in the Senate. All those churches. That Senator Feinstein knew His Holiness even when His Holiness came to the United States for the first time. She was the mayor of San Francisco, and she offered the key of San Francisco to His Holiness during His Holiness' first visit to the United States. All those changes. In 87 we did that. Then in 88 there was a Strasbourg proposal expanding on the 5th part of the peace proposal. And 1989 His Holiness received the Nobel Peace Prize. Then His Holiness became very famous all over the world. In 1990, as part of an omnibus bill to move in about 30,000 Polish people into the United States, we have one friend in Connecticut. He's still alive. So most of your parents who are here should be thankful to these people for moving that bill in 1990. As part of that omnibus, they put 1,000 Tibetans in there. In terms of Palada, Amlada, Pola, Mumulanda, they layer the decisions are. So you should know how His Holiness and the Central Tibetan Administration, the Tibetan community has been helpful in getting your parents here. And that's also the reason why you are here. In 1990, the Voice of America Tibetan Service started. 1991, His Holiness the Dalai Lama for the first time met with the sitting President of the United States on April 16. That year was also declared as the International Year of Tibet. Kale mangu gemni pe sera ya dotu yore amrega nalola tidu konzo kiwu yore 겨울음지 집유래 난데서 뭐 konzo 겨울음지 치래 짜라이 여러와 도전 상황 치에 열 다 등산 겨울음지 제일 더 챙겨다 침부쳐 미망고 쇼치도 선발 때 뭐지 경고 유도 선발 하고 여래. Then in 1991, His Holiness, again 2 days after meeting with the President, Bush Sr., also addressed informal joint session of the Parliament. Because if you go to Washington, D.C., you see that building, the Capitol building, and the middle is the Rotunda, Capitol Rotunda. and then half of it is Senate, half of it is House. So to formally address a Congress, you need to be a president of a government or prime minister of a government, since His Holiness is not one. So informally, all the members of House came from one side, members of Senate came from the other side, and His Holiness spoke at the Capitol Rotunda for the first time. And then Tibet issue gained a lot more traction. Then it began, a lot more Hollywood people got involved in it, a lot more singers, the Mangweshe, and Beastie Boys, and Beastie Boys, students for Free Tibet. At one time we were talking about 500 chapters of students for Free Tibet in the United States alone. Right. This year, 1993, Radio Free Asia Tibetan Service called Super 8. 1997, we had the first special coordinator for Tibet. And 2000 onwards, we started moving on the Tibet Policy Act. And that was also the time that the Chinese government was pushing to host the Olympics, which was for them a huge coming out party to show the world that they can handle these kind of things. This was Clinton's time. Okay? Clinton, this was also the period when China got enrolled into the World Trade Organization, and then there was a free trade agreement signed between the Chinese government and the US government. And as a rider to that, Congressional Executive Commission on China, CEC, which is still there, it's a bicameral commission of the United States to oversee human rights situation inside Tibet. And then Tibet Policy Act of 2002 was adopted. And the United States is the only country that has a law on Tibet. So the State Department and the White House has to report to the Congress every single year on the status of negotiation and all other provisions of that law. And because of that law, the United States government also started giving us financial support to the Tibetan in diaspora to preserve their identity in terms of their language, culture, religion, and way of life. Okay? Then 2006, they seven the US Congressional Gold Medal. Seven. 2007, the highest civilian honor that could be given by the Congress was His Holiness was honored with that, the US Congressional Gold Medal. And then there was, when I came in as the representative of His Holiness Dalai Lama in 2017, the reciprocal access to Tibet bill was already in the Congress, and those people behind pushing those were International Campaign for Tibet. So ICT has played a very important role in shaping these things alongside the officers of Tibet. Even now, we work very closely to push things, right? And then Rata Act was passed. What does that mean, reciprocal access to? If a Chinese person has a visa to come to the United States, that Chinese person can go to any parts of the United States. Whereas an American, if they have a visa to go to China, they can go to China but not go to Tibet. You need another permit to go to Tibet. So that is what this reciprocity in diplomacy is what it's all about, the reciprocal access to Tibet. Well, so if a Chinese person has a US visa, can visit any part of China, US, then a US person, including you all who are US citizens now, should be able to visit any part of China with a Chinese visa. That is Rata Act. And then again, in 2020, the Tibet Policy Act was amended to Tibet Support and Policy Act, which included the issue about reincarnation of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, whereby the United States government has made their position very clear that the reincarnation of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama will be decided by His Holiness and the Tibetan people. So this is where we stand. And after we came in, I took oath of office on May 27, 2021, and this was huge pandemic time, and we couldn't go out. Only in 2022, our Chirikane, DIR Minister Nonzito Mala managed to come to the United States, met with the other Secretary of State, who is also the Special Secretary, Special Coordinator for Tibetan issues in the State Department. And I came in April. Namjila had already taken over in November before that year, and we worked very hard to get things going. We always have a strategy meeting with the leaders in the Congress, and we decided on three things. One, to organize the World Parliamentarians Convention on Tibet in June in Washington, D.C., and the presence of Speaker Pelosi was requested, and that happened on June 22nd and June 23rd of last year. And then the other thing was to organize an expert's testimonial on the historical status of Tibet as an independent country by 4 people. One is Michael Manuel Prague. You should read his book called Tibet Brief 2020. I will not go more into detail. And there is also a Chinese professor called Professor Lau Han-tin, who's also now retired and lives in San Diego. He was a professor at the City University of Hong Kong, a professor of economics. But after he retired, he wrote this book. And their approaches are totally different, but the outcome is same, that Tibet has never been considered part of China. Okay, these 2 books. The Laos book will come in English pretty soon, so you should read that. This year, was there, any Ellen Borg was also these 4 people were the experts in the U.S. Congress for the first time. The historical status of Tibet as an independent country is on the record of the Congress of the United States. So historically, this is important for us. Now, the third job is based on that testimony. Now, a bill has been moved in the U.S. Congress. It was moved in the previous houses, both Senate and House. Now it was reintroduced because the system demands so, and it's being now moved by in the House. One good thing about Tibet, the issue of Tibet, is that we have bipartisan support from both the Republicans and the Democrats, and bicameral support both from the Senate and the House of Representatives. So in the House, it's moved by Chairman McCall. Because McCall, now the Republicans hold the House, so Michael McCall has become chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. He's leading that bill alongside Representative Jim McGovern. In the Senate, we have Senator Merkley, moved that, and is from here. Merkley is from here, right? Merkley is from here, and then you have Todd Young from the Republicans. So this is being moved, and you also have to work. There are petitions to be signed. Are you listening? Distraction. There are ready-made petitions that can be signed. You can ask your classmates also to sign. Ask many people to sign to support that bill. Any these are small things that you can do for Tibet. And there will be a Tibet Lobby Day on March 27th and 28th, organized by Tibet International Campaign for Tibet in Washington, D.C. We are trying to seek as much participation as possible. We're thinking about at least 100 people, 150 people coming from all different states of the United States to lobby in the Congress to support this bill. So once this bill is enacted into our law, then the historical independent status of Tibet will also be a law. Therein, what we are saying is that China always uses propaganda and false narrative on the historical status of Tibet. And the United States government should counter that false narrative. And that bill also says that the United States government recognizes that Tibet is an unresolved conflict which needs to be resolved. Okay, Andresha. Okay, this is just to give you an overview. And the days and Shuman for me get it to a Palayo. And Lavamena and Kazum Kazu with you, they go for it, and the Hakobo education with it. And please please, France will again keep, we get inspired. Then we feel that, okay, there is the younger generation to take responsibility in Asia. Right. So please give a little more importance, attention to the information that you need to learn. So just check.
Thank you.